In the winter of 1941, Winston Churchill sat in the cabinet war rooms beneath Whitehall and looked at a map that told him two things simultaneously. The first was that Britain was still alive, which in December of 1941 was not something that could be taken for granted. The second was that Britain could not win the war alone, which was something Churchill had understood since the fall of France in June of 1940 and had been working towards solving ever since. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7th of 1941 solved the problem Churchill could not solve himself. It brought the United States into the war fully and irrevocably, which meant it brought American industrial capacity, American manpower, and American money into a conflict that Britain had been fighting with insufficient quantities of all three for 18 months. Churchill understood what this meant immediately and completely. He had been a student of power his entire life, and he recognized a shift in the fundamental balance of it when he saw one. What it meant was that Britain was no longer fighting for survival. It was now fighting for position. The question was no longer whether the Axis powers would be defeated with American strength committed. That outcome was, in Churchill's assessment, mathematically inevitable given sufficient time. The question was what the world would look like after the defeat, who would have shaped the strategy that produced it, and whether Britain would emerge from the war as a power that had directed events or as a nation that had been directed by them. Churchill understood this distinction with a clarity that very few people around him fully shared, and that almost none of his American counterparts initially appreciated. He understood that the alliance being formed in December of 1941 was not simply a military partnership between equal nations combining their strength against a common enemy. It was the beginning of a competition for post-war influence conducted through the IA, instrument of military command. The nation whose generals led the alliance, whose strategic vision shaped the campaign, whose officers held the senior positions in the combined command structure, would be the nation whose interests were served by the outcome. Britain had one significant advantage in this competition that Churchill intended to press as hard as the traffic would bear. It had experience. The British Army had been fighting since September of 1939. Its senior commanders had commanded formations in combat in France, in North Africa, in East Africa, in the Middle East. They had made mistakes and learned from them in the hardest possible school. They understood combined arms warfare, coalition management, and the specific brutal complexity of fighting the German military in a way that no American commander could match in December of 1941, because no American commander had yet been required to. The plan Churchill began developing in the weeks after Pearl Harbor built directly on this advantage. It was never written down in a single document. It was never presented to the Americans as a formal proposal. It existed instead in a series of decisions, positions, and structural arrangements that Churchill advanced incrementally through the combined Chiefs of Staff machinery that was being assembled in Washington in early 1942. Each individual element looked reasonable in isolation. The cumulative effect, if it had been fully realized, would have placed a British officer in operational command of every American soldier committed to the European theater. It very nearly worked. The combined Chiefs of Staff was established in Washington in February of 1942 as the supreme military coordinating body for the Anglo-American alliance. It brought together the British Chiefs of Staff, headed by General Sir Alan Brookie, with the American Joint Chiefs, headed initially by General George Marshall, under an arrangement that was supposed to give both nations equal voice in determining Allied strategy. Equal voice on paper, something considerably less equal in practice, at least in the early months. The British chiefs arrived at those first combined meetings with fully developed strategic positions, detailed operational assessments, and the institutional confidence of men who had been making life-and-death decisions about the war for 2 years. The American chiefs arrived with energy, resources, and an army that was still in the process of expanding from a peacetime force of fewer than 200,000 men to the multi-million-man force that the war would eventually require. The disparity in experience translated directly into a disparity in influence, at least initially, and Churchill understood this and intended to extend it for as long as possible. General Sir Alan Brooke was the instrument through which Churchill worked. Brooke was chief of the Imperial General Staff from November of 1941, which made him the professional head of the British Army and Churchill's primary military advisor. He was also by virtually every assessment of the men who worked with him, including the American officers who frequently found themselves on the losing end of his arguments, one of the most formidable strategic minds of the war. He was cold, precise, impatient with imprecision, and relentless in his pursuit of the British strategic position in combined meetings. Brooke and Churchill did not always agree. Their private relationship, documented in Brooke's diaries, with a candor that Churchill presumably did not anticipate would eventually be published, was one of the most complicated professional partnerships of the war. Brooke thought Churchill's strategic instincts were frequently brilliant and frequently dangerous in approximately equal measure. Churchill thought Brooke was essential and occasionally infuriating. They argued constantly, and they agreed on the fundamental position consistently. Britain needed to control the strategic direction of the war, and controlling the strategic direction meant controlling the senior commands. The structural argument they advanced through the combined chiefs in the first half of 1942 was elegant in its simplicity. The British had the experience. The British had the theater knowledge. The British had the established command relationships with the local forces and the political contacts with the regional governments across North Africa and the Middle East. Therefore, the British should hold the senior theater commands in any operation that involved the existing British areas of operation, which, in early 1942, meant essentially every theater where ground combat was occurring. The Americans were skeptical, but not yet in a position to argue from strength. Their forces were still mobilizing. Their commanders were still untested in combat. Marshall understood the structural position the British were advancing, and he did not like it. But he also understood that arguing against experience with inexperience was a losing proposition in a combined staff meeting, and that the counter to the British position was going to have to be built on performance rather than assertion. The test case was North Africa. Operation Torch, the Allied landing in French Northwest Africa planned for November of 1942, was the first major combined Anglo-American operation of the war. The command arrangement for Torch would establish the precedent that everything following it would be built on. Churchill and Brooke pushed for a British theater commander. Marshall pushed back. The compromise that emerged from the argument was Dwight Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, with a British deputy, and British officers filling the majority of the senior subordinate command positions beneath him. It looked like a compromise. It was structured as a mechanism, with British officers commanding the ground, air, and naval components beneath an American Supreme Commander who was new to theater command and dependent on his British subordinates for institutional knowledge. The effective operational authority in the Mediterranean resided with the British regardless of what the organizational chart said at the top. Churchill had not gotten everything he wanted. He had gotten enough to work with. The plan reached its most dangerous moment in the summer of 1942, and the danger came from a direction that neither Churchill nor Brooke had fully anticipated. It came from Churchill himself. The question of who would command the eventual Allied invasion of Northwest Europe had been under discussion since the first combined chiefs meetings in February. It was understood by everyone involved that this command would be the most consequential military appointment of the war. The officer who held it would direct the largest amphibious operation in history, command the forces that would fight the decisive campaign of the Western War, and occupy the position that history would most closely associate with the defeat of Nazi Germany. Churchill wanted that officer to be British. His preferred candidate was Brooke. He told Brooke so directly in the summer of 1942, and watched Brooke receive the information with the controlled discipline of a man who had trained himself not to want things too visibly, because wanting things too visibly in the proximity of Churchill was dangerous. Brookie wanted the command. He had wanted it since the question had first been raised. He believed he was the right man for it, and his private diary contains enough careful and qualified statements on the subject to make his conviction clear without quite stating it baldly. The argument Churchill and Brooke were constructing for why the Supreme Command should go to a British officer ran as follows. The forces committed to the initial phase of the invasion would be predominantly British and Commonwealth. The existing theater infrastructure, the logistics networks, the airfield systems, the port facilities, the accumulated operational experience of 3 years of Mediterranean and Atlantic warfare had been built by British effort and was administered by British institutions. Placing an American officer in supreme command of a predominantly British force operating on British logistical foundations without the operational experience the command required was, the argument went, an unnecessary risk at the decisive moment of the war. It was a serious argument. It was also a self-serving one, and Marshall understood both of these things. Marshall had been watching the command architecture the British were building since February, and he had been performing his own calculation throughout. He understood that the supreme command of the European invasion was not simply a military appointment, it was a political one. It would reflect which nation was providing the preponderance of the resources for the decisive campaign. It would determine which nation's strategic priorities shaped the execution of that campaign. It would establish for the remainder of the war and for the post-war settlement that followed which nation had led the alliance to victory. By the autumn of 1942, Marshall's calculation was producing a clear answer. American forces would shortly outnumber British forces in every theater. American industrial production was already surpassing British production by a margin that would only grow. American manpower, American equipment, American fuel and ammunition were becoming the material foundation on which the entire Allied war effort rested. The nation providing that foundation was not going to accept a command structure that gave strategic authority to the nation it was supplying. He took his assessment to Roosevelt, and Roosevelt understood it immediately because Roosevelt had been performing the same calculation from the political rather than the military side. The supreme command of the European invasion would go to an American officer. That decision was made in principle by the end of 1942 and confirmed in practice by the time Eisenhower was formally appointed in December of 1943. Brookie learned that he would not receive the command he had been promised in the summer of 1943. The entry in his diary for the day Churchill told him is one of the most restrained and most devastating passages in the entire document. He recorded that he had understood the reasons. He recorded that he accepted the decision. He recorded almost nothing about what it cost him, which was itself a form of testimony. Churchill had pushed as far as the structural reality of the alliance would allow, and had found the limit. The supreme command went to Eisenhower. The question now was how much authority the British could retain beneath it. The appointment of Eisenhower as supreme commander for the European invasion did not end the British campaign to control the operational direction of the war. It redirected it. Churchill and Brooke pivoted from the question of who held the supreme command to the question of what that command actually controlled, and they pursued the second question with the same systematic persistence they had applied to the first. If the Americans would hold the title, the British would hold the substance. If Eisenhower sat at the top of the organizational chart, British officers would fill the positions immediately beneath him that made the operational decisions. The model had already been established in the Mediterranean. Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, General Sir Harold Alexander as Ground Forces Commander, Admiral Sir Andrew Cunningham as Naval Commander, Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Teeter as Air Commander. 3 of the 4 principal operational commands in British hands beneath an American Supreme Commander, who was new to theater command and who relied on his British subordinates for the institutional knowledge and the operational relationships that the theater required. Alexander was the key figure in this arrangement and one whose position most directly embodied Churchill's ambition. As Ground Forces Commander, Alexander was the officer who translated Eisenhower's strategic direction into operational orders for the armies in the field. He commanded both British and American ground forces. In practice, this meant he commanded American soldiers. In practice, this meant that the blood and guts philosophy, the doctrinal arguments, the operational priorities, and the resource allocation decisions that determined how American soldiers were used in the Mediterranean theater were being made by a British general. This was exactly what Churchill had designed it to be. The Americans beneath Alexander noticed. Omar Bradley, commanding the 2nd Corps in Tunisia under Alexander's 18th Army Group, spent the spring of 1943 forming an assessment of the arrangement that he later recorded in terms that were diplomatic in their language and unambiguous in their conclusion. Alexander managed American forces as though they were a component to be directed rather than a partner to be consulted. He assigned missions, adjusted boundaries, and reallocated resources between national contingents without the kind of coordination with American commanders that Bradley believed the relationship required. Bradley raised his concerns with Eisenhower. Eisenhower listened, acknowledged the problem, and did what he always did with problems that existed at the intersection of military effectiveness and political necessity. He managed. He found ways to give American commanders enough operational latitude that they could perform effectively while preserving the structural arrangement that the alliance required and that Churchill and Brooke were not prepared to abandon. But the structural arrangement was producing a specific and recurring problem when American formations underperformed against expectations, which happened in Tunisia before the 2nd Corps had accumulated the combat experience it needed. Alexander interpreted the underperformance as evidence that American forces required closer supervision and tighter British control. When American formations performed well, Alexander adjusted the operational plan in ways that reduced American roles and expanded British ones, which is what happened in Sicily when Patton's 7th Army was assigned the flank mission while Montgomery's 8th Army was given the drive on Messina. The pattern was consistent because the intent behind it was consistent. The British command structure in the Mediterranean was not simply managing American forces. It was managing American forces in ways designed to confirm the proposition that American forces needed British management. Marshall saw the pattern clearly. He had been watching it since Tunisia. He had been receiving Bradley's assessments and Eisenhower's carefully worded reports and performing his own analysis of the operational record. His conclusion was that the Mediterranean command arrangement had reached the limit of what American military culture and American political reality would accept. The European invasion would not be structured the same way. Operation Overlord, the Allied invasion of northwestern France that launched on June 6 of 1944, was built on a command structure that represented the resolution of the argument Churchill and Brooke had been making since February of 1942. It was not the resolution either of them had wanted. It was the resolution that the arithmetic of the alliance had made inevitable. Eisenhower as Supreme Commander, Montgomery as Ground Forces Commander for the initial phase, which was the concession to British experience and British political necessity that Marshall had been prepared to make from the beginning. British officers in the senior air and naval commands but with a critical structural difference from the Mediterranean arrangement. The ground forces command that Montgomery held was explicitly temporary. As American forces built up in France and American formations came to outnumber British ones, operational command of American forces would pass to an American Army Group commander. The structural arrangement that had given British officers authority over American soldiers in the Mediterranean was designed into overlord with its own expiration. Churchill understood what this meant. Brooke understood it more clearly still because Brooke was the one sitting across the table from Marshall in the combined chiefs meetings where the command arrangements were negotiated. And Brooke had a precise and unsentimental understanding of what the Americans were and were not prepared to accept. What it meant was that the campaign to put a British general in charge of all American forces had reached its terminal point. The best outcome achievable from the British position was Montgomery's temporary ground forces command, which would last for the initial phase of the Normandy campaign, and would be replaced by an American Army Group structure as soon as the buildup of American forces made that replacement operationally justifiable. Montgomery held the ground forces command through the summer of 1944. He exercised it with the conviction that he was the right officer for the position and with the operational style that had characterized his command since El Magen. Meticulous preparation, set-piece battles, overwhelming force applied to a narrow front. It was a method that had worked in the desert and in Sicily against specific conditions that the Normandy campaign replicated in some respects and departed from in others. The American commanders beneath Montgomery's authority spent the summer of 1944 forming the same assessment that Bradley had formed in Tunisia and Sicily. Montgomery managed American forces as though their primary function was to serve the requirements of his operational design, rather than as independent formations capable of generating their own operational results. Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army under Montgomery's 12th Army Group, accumulated his observations with the patience that was his most consistent professional characteristic, and raised his concerns with Eisenhower through the same channels he had used in Tunisia. In September of 1944, Eisenhower assumed direct command of Allied ground forces, ending Montgomery's authority over American formations. The transition had been built into the Overlord command structure from the beginning, and it proceeded as planned. Montgomery protested. He argued for an extension of his command on operational grounds. He argued that the broad front strategy Eisenhower was implementing was inferior to the concentrated northern thrust he was proposing. He appealed to Churchill, and Churchill raised the matter with Eisenhower, and Eisenhower absorbed political pressure with the diplomatic skill that was his most essential professional quality, and proceeded with the transition. The British campaign to command American forces had not ended, but it had been reduced from a structural arrangement to an argument, and arguments in an alliance where one partner was providing the preponderance of the forces were governed by a different set of rules than structural arrangements. Marshall had understood this from February of 1942. By September of 1944, the operational record had made it visible to everyone else as well. Churchill's plan to put a British general in charge of all American forces never appeared in a single document with that title. It was never presented to the Americans as a formal proposal, and it was never acknowledged by the British as a coordinated strategy. But it was real. It was pursued with consistency and sophistication across 3 years of alliance management, and it came considerably closer to succeeding than the official histories of the period typically acknowledge. It succeeded partially. British officers commanded American forces in the Mediterranean from November of 1942 through the end of the Sicilian campaign in August of 1943. Montgomery commanded all Allied ground forces, including American formations during the initial phase of the Normandy campaign from June through September of 1944 for periods totaling more than a year across the course of the war. British generals directed the operational employment of American soldiers in the most consequential campaigns of the European theater. What prevented full success was not American awareness of the British intent, though Marshall's awareness was clear and early. What prevented it was the arithmetic of the alliance itself. Churchill's plan was built on British experience and American inexperience, and inexperience was a condition with a natural expiration date. American formations accumulated combat experience in Tunisia and Sicily and Normandy. American commanders developed the operational judgment that comes only from directing formations in contact with a competent enemy over sustained periods. American forces grew in number until they represented not a junior partner requiring British supervision, but the dominant element of the Allied order of battle. Each of these developments eroded the foundation of the British argument. By the time the Rhine crossing was being planned in early 1945, the proposition that British experience justified British command of American forces was operationally indefensible and politically unsustainable. American formations had fought their way across France. American commanders had managed the crisis of the Bulge. American logistics were sustaining the entire Allied advance. The argument that Americans needed British supervision to be effective had been answered by the operational record in terms that no combined staff meeting could override. Brooke understood the trajectory before most of his colleagues did. His diaries from the later years of the war record an increasing frustration with the American commanders across the table in combined meetings. A frustration that reads, on close examination, less like contempt for American military ability, and more like the frustration of a man watching an argument he has been making from a position of genuine strength gradually become an argument he is making from a position of genuine weakness. The experience advantage that had given the British their leverage in 1942 was gone by 1944. What remained was the institutional habit of advancing the British position conducted now without the operational foundation that had originally justified it. Churchill never fully acknowledged the failure of the plan, which was consistent with his general approach to failures of this magnitude. He continued to press for British operational influence through the final year of the war, continued to raise strategic objections to Eisenhower's broad front approach through every available channel, continued to argue for the northern thrust that would have kept the decisive campaign in Montgomery's hands rather than distributing it across an American Army group structure. He was persistent, and he was creative, and he was occasionally effective at the margins. But the fundamental question of who commanded American forces had been answered by the autumn of 1944, and the answer was Americans. Marshall had built his resistance to the British campaign on the same foundation that Churchill had built the campaign itself, which was a clear understanding of where power actually resided and what it would eventually require. Marshall had understood from February of 1942 that American industrial capacity and American manpower meant that American commanders would eventually command American forces regardless of what the initial command arrangement said. He had been patient, and he had been prepared, and he had been right. The deeper lesson of Churchill's plan is not that it failed. It is how close it came to succeeding, and what that proximity revealed about the nature of alliance warfare. Command structures in combined operations are not neutral technical arrangements. They are political decisions with operational consequences. And the nation that allows another to determine those structures at the beginning of a campaign may find that changing them once the campaign is underway is considerably more difficult than the initial arrangement suggested. The Americans learned this lesson in Tunisia and applied it to every command negotiation that followed. Marshall carried the lesson with him through the combined chiefs' meetings in London and Washington and Quebec and Cairo, and made sure that each successive command arrangement moved the structural authority over American forces closer to American hands. It was not aggressive or confrontational. It was methodical, And it was sustained, and it was grounded in the same clear understanding of where power resided that Churchill had brought to the alliance from the other direction. Two men who both understood power earlier and more completely than almost anyone around them. One, trying to hold an advantage that the arithmetic of the war was eliminating. The other waiting with professional patience for the arithmetic to finish its work. History records Churchill as the great strategist of the war. It records Marshall as the great organizer. What neither description fully captures is that both men were engaged in the same fundamental activity throughout the alliance they built together. They were both at every moment, from Pearl Harbor to the German surrender, calculating exactly where the power was, exactly where it was going, and exactly how much of it they could hold. Churchill held more of it for longer than the arithmetic strictly justified. That was the measure of his achievement. Marshall made sure the arithmetic eventually prevailed. That was the measure of his. The British general who commanded all American forces was never appointed. The plan that would have appointed him was real, was sophisticated, was pursued with the full weight of Churchill's political genius, and was defeated not by American cleverness, but by American mass. In the end, the argument was settled the way most collision warfare arguments are settled, not at the negotiating table, on the ground, in the numbers, in the weight of the forces that had to be fed and fueled and commanded, and in the political reality that the nation bearing that weight was not going to bear it indefinitely under someone else's direction. The stars fell on the class of 1915, but they landed where the weight of the war put them. And by 1945, that weight was American.